Hey class, we're going to go ahead and get started with our next lecture, which is lecture 6. This is the history of physical activity. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started with the material. All right, when discussing history of physical activity, first we need to understand what are our lecture objectives. This lecture is going to be basically just like the goals of history during different time periods. We're going to focus mainly on the Greeks, the Roman civilizations. We'll get into Renaissance, Middle Ages, 1800s, 1900s, and all the way up to present day. This is a little bit longer lecture, so I'm going to break it into two parts. First thing we want to understand is why do we actually study the history of physical activity? Most importantly is to understand the changes that have taken place across centuries, from early time periods of engaging in exercise to today, and then also what has stayed the same. So we're looking at changes in stability that helps us understand the past, the present, and then also helps us to predict what type of physical activity may be done in the future. We also want to understand some terms. In my slides, you'll see BC and AD, and you can see what those two stand for right there. And then right underneath that, you see BCE and CE. So BC and AD are the terms used to define the timeline of history in by Christians, so with Christianity. Whereas BCE and CE are secular terms that don't have anything to do with Christianity, but still are denoting certain time frames. We're going to start in about 3000 BC, which you see is kind of on this BC side past that 2000. And then we'll move all the way up to the 0. So it counts down to 0, and then it counts back up in the AD timeframe. Here's another way to conceptualize what we'll be talking about in this lecture. Is first, I actually want you to think about 65 million years ago is when it is said that dinosaurs roamed the land. And so look here at this chart you see, or this timeline we see, about 3 million years ago is when we have this first human species basically was said to roam the land. So we're actually not going to start until about what you see as ancient age is 3000 BC, the invention of writing. That's why we have historical artifacts, and we have timelines, and we have basically what was going on at this time. And then we'll move into that medieval age, modern age, and then to contemporary age. But this is just for you to kind of see kind of how we're going to discuss, or kind of looking at the timeline or the time frame in which we'll be talking about history today. All right, so first, like I said, starting in about 3000 BC, all the way up to about 1000 BC, we're starting at looking at early cultures, Egypt, China, and India. And so they all had slightly different basically ideas about how to be physically active. Most of these cultures is the military and warriors trained physically to improve physical fitness, to have a strong militia front. Whereas the like civilized, or the what am I trying to say? Just like normal civilization mainly just did life-preserving exercises, basically to help with longevity. They also did certain types of physical exercise when we see festivals and rituals and dance. So all these different types of activities were performed, but they weren't performed for the purpose of getting fit. They were mainly just performed for cultural activities. We see another one down here at the bottom, yoga, which we as commonly practice today, as well as meditation, was first noted to be done in India during those early time frames. Next, we'll spend some time looking at ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, we know, is characterized by something called the Greek ideal, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then we have the Homeric era, which is kind of denoted with the funeral games, which is very similar to ancient Olympic games, boxing, chariot racing, wrestling, throwing, etc. And then we'll get into the Spartans. Spartans, what you need to know about the Spartans is they had a very strong military front. They valued military supremacy, where both men and women trained physically. So let's first discuss the Greek ideal. And so what these Greeks were trying to do is emulate a Greek god. And so if you are familiar with Greek gods, they are considered to be part man, part god. There's lots of different Greek gods, and they all have some sort of purpose or something that they are tied to. They are believed to have these superior intellect and physical capabilities. And so the Greeks wanted to emulate this, and they created something called the man of action and the man of wisdom, where the man of action they valued sport skills and being physically fit, which helped them with military prowess. And then the man of wisdom, you want you to think of like intellectual, cognitive, emotional type development. So development of the mind and philosophical ideals. And so they valued both of them. And then we'll talk about how during different times during ancient Greek that the man of action and the man of wisdom would actually switch in priority among the Greeks. And so we'll discuss that as well. So let's talk about the homework era. The homework era, okay, so now if you look at our time frame, we're about 1200 to 776 BC. During this time, we are discussing first the era, the aristocrats. The aristocrats in this time frame, they did play sports, and these sports were able to help them develop their militial type skills. So skills in order to be the strongest warrior. They were practiced by noblemen who were training physically to have like a strong front. Also, you should be probably familiar with Homer, where this homework era came from. You may have read the Iliad or the Odyssey growing up, and these two stories describe basically, well, first I'll just start with the Iliad. The Iliad discusses the funeral games, which I discussed a second ago. The funeral games were created in honor of Homer's friend Patroclus, and Patroclus was someone who died in the Trojan War. He died in the Trojan War. He was friends with Achilles. And so you're probably familiar with Achilles and Patroclus, and the demise of their kind of militial front during this time. And this is where Homer created these funeral games in honor of Patroclus. And then you also may be familiar with the Odyssey. The Odyssey is about Odysseus, who was actually got lost wandering around the island of the Phaeacians. And he couldn't escape. He couldn't get back home. And so there was this kind of story, also known as myth, like this mythological story, where in order for Homer to escape this island, he had to throw a discus farther than any of the Phaeacians. And he was able to do that. So he was able to throw this discus farther than anyone else. And that's actually what granted him free pass across the lands back home. And so these two stories, again, like I said, you're probably familiar with them, but this homework error is kind of in honor of both of these two mythological tales. All right, next let's get into the Spartas. The Spartas versus the Athenians is actually one of my favorite stories. We're looking kind of later in our time frame, 776 to 371 BC. So if you're familiar with Sparta, it is a city-state in Greece. There were several city-states at this time. Sparta was one of the largest, as well as Athens. And so again, probably familiar with those. Early Spartan years, there was still a lot of freedom in this city-state, and it was not controlled by like their government at this time. They enjoyed a lot of cultural activities. And men, women were free to kind of practice and do whatever they wanted. But then kind of as we move past the 76, moving up, man of action is what took over. And this man of action forced all the young boys, girls to start training physically in order to they wanted the strongest military of this time. They wanted to be the strongest city-state in Greece. So then the state started to control life and education. And they did not have freedom anymore, and they really had to, all they really did at this time was train physically. The mothers would train girls at home in gymnastics and just certain types of calisthenics, and their goal was to bear healthy children. And so that's the sole purpose of a young girl and adolescent at this time, was to be able to create healthy children. And then the boys were also raised at home training physically, I think till about the age of 7. But the city state controlled, the health. They basically decided after a child was born, the state did, the government, if the child was strong enough to live. And so again, there was not a lot of freedom during this time. Everything was controlled by the Spartan city states government. And so let's kind of look at what happened age-wise. Like I said, boys were trained at home until age 7. Age 7 to 20, they stayed in something called barracks, which were these training camps to train for the military. And then between ages 20 and 30, they actually went into the military and fought for the city-state of Sparta. At age 30, a male was able to become a citizen. So is actually considered to be like a man of Sparta, actually kind of like put into like the city-state government. And then between 30 and 50, those males then would train the younger boys in the barracks. So they served in the war early, and then once they, graduated from that, they then would just train the younger boys. This was a very narrow-minded society. Like it says, all they cared about was conquering. So there was this one point in Sparta history where there were only 9,000 Spartans, but they had 250,000 captives. So think about that. Think about having all of these captives, but only a very small number of Spartans to actually rule over them. And so what do you think happened? Is the captives overtook the Spartans. But before that occurred, during this time, the Spartans dominated the Olympics every single year. And we'll talk about the Olympics, we starting in 776 BC, the first Olympic Games. The Spartans were very dominant. But let's talk about what led to the downfall of the Spartans. Is they became so narrow-minded and only trained physically. They only cared about the man of action, and they ignored the man of wisdom. And so they actually had no knowledge on how to control all of their captives and the land that they had conquered. And eventually that's what led to their downfall, is that they had too many captives, they had too much land and too many people that they were trying to control, and they didn't know how to handle it. And so then the captives took over, and that's what led to the downfall of the Spartas. But again, kind of crazy. All right, now we're into the Athenian era. Okay, so we'll look back at the timeline. We're kind of starting back. So we have to go back a little bit because this took place at the same time as the Sparta. So we had Sparta, and then we had Athens. So back to about 1300 BC. We had kind of different time periods. We have the early Athenians and the late Athenians, and then we'll discuss the Olympic Games. This here just kind of gives you like brief little tidbits of each one that you can look at, but let's get into it. Is during the early Athenian era, this was a very liberal, progressive city-state where we had a lot of freedom for women, very democratic, involving everyone in the decision-making for the city-state, very unlike what the Spartans did when Sparta started to have control, like city-state control. The Greek ideal, the unity of man, of action, and wisdom. So they trained in the early Athenian era, both very physically, but they also had a lot of intellectual training. They had a lot of time to focus on education. They trained the young boys and girls in morals. It does say girls had very little intellectual or physical training, which is very dissimilar from the Spartas, whereas the girls did do training. In the Athenian era, the females did not have a lot of training. It was mainly focused on the boys, the men. Also, a difference is the males were able to become citizens at age 18 in Athens, and compared to Sparta, where they weren't able to become a citizen until age 30. the males were subject to this military service early on and only for a shorter time frame. So from age 18 to 20. The upper class citizens, they did do physical workouts. They had a lot of intellectual discussions at these state furnished gymnasiums. And so these gymnasiums were places where these upper class males would go and have these intellectual or philosophical discussions. And they also did physical workouts here. The Athenians, so now we're in this later Athenian era. If you look at the time frame, the Athenians had really strong military success in the Persian War, which actually led to more freedom, more individualism, more self-confidence. This was called the Golden Age in Greece for the Athenians in Athens, where cultural explosion was really high during this time. They really focused on a lot of the philosophies that are being learned and a lot of the intellectual type training and education. A lot of man of wisdom became the priority. And they actually started to ignore the man of action. And so this loss of interest in physical development occurred as intellectualism was overemphasized, and that's what led to their downfall. They actually were conquered by the Macedonians, and since they stopped training physically and their military was very weak, the Macedonians took over Athens, and again, that's what led to the downfall of the Athenians. All right, next is looking at the Olympics, which Olympics, if you are familiar with Panhellenic, that term is just used to describe like Greek festivals, and so or Greek activities. So these Greek athletic festivals, there are several different ones, as you see here. You can see the place they were held, who they honored, etc., when they were founded. But the first known Panhellenic festival is the Olympics, and so that's what we're really going to focus on the most. But I like this map at the bottom down here is you can see Olympia. You can see these other city-states. You can see Athens over there. These are the Panhellenic Games sites in Greece. But like I said, we're just going to focus on the most popular one, the Olympic Games, held in Olympia, Greece, every 4 years in honor of Zeus. Cultural interaction between city-states. I like this point right here is during the Olympics, they actually allowed a safe passage for anybody crossing from different city-states into Greece or through Greece. So even those city-states who were at war with each other were at like a ceasefire. They were not engaged. They would not allow any engagement in war during the Olympic times. So spectators and competitors could pass back and forth across Greece from city-state to city-state, which I think is really great. What events did they do? Some events are similar to what we actually do today. Foot races, like sprinting around a track. Stades, which is like running down and back across a stadium. They had different distances. Wrestling, a pentathlon, long jump. We still do jumping events today. Javelin, discus, the shot put, boxing, and chariot races. So lots of different activities. And so the Olympics lasted from 776 all the way up to crossing into 393 AD. But then there was this emperor who wanted to ban all pagan festivals. And so that ended the ancient Olympics for almost 12 centuries, which is very wild. And then after that 1500 years where we had no Olympic Games, they did rise again, thanks to Pierre de Coubertin, who was a Frenchman who decided that the Olympic Games should be held again, and they should be held in the place where they first started in ancient Greece. And so they moved the first Olympic Games in 1896 to Athens. Only males could compete, though. Females were not allowed to compete until the 1900s, which was held in Paris. But I think there were only 2 events for females. It was tennis, maybe golf, but I know tennis for sure, croquet probably, and then a few other little sports that women could participate in. And then every year after, we see an increase in the amount of sports and females that are able to compete. So this year is really fascinating. The history of the marathon. Obviously, the marathon is a new event. It was not competed. It was not done in the ancient Olympics. And so what is the legend of Pheidippides? And so what I want y'all to do is watch this video down here at the bottom, and it talks about the legend of Pheidippides and the history of the marathon, which is really interesting. And if you look over here, we see Greece, Sparta, Athens, and then a city-state called Marathon. And so you can kind of assume that Pheidippides is somebody who actually ran the distance of this marathon. What he was really doing is he was delivering news to Sparta, Athens, Marathon back and forth, delivering news of winning different wars between city-states. And if you watch this little video here, or if you Google it, it's actually a very fascinating story. All right, next we are in Rome and medieval Europe. So now we're in around 1500 BC. We're going to talk about the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and then get into medieval Europe. So this here just talks about like basics, like tidbits from like each little background here that you can just kind of glance at, look at, read on your own. But let's kind of first get into our Roman Republic, about 500 BC up to 27 BC. If you see, we did kind of finish Greece in like that early AD period. Okay, so we've backed up, but now we are in Italy. Okay, we're in Rome. We're no longer in Greece. So again, a lot of these time frames, they do occur at the same time, or these timelines can at the same time, but now we're just moving to a different part of the country. And so what we want to talk about here is this Aristotle establishment of a new government. We had these upper echelons who had the most influence over what was happening in Rome. And they called that this aristocratic oligarchy, which is basically a small group of aristocrats that basically controlled Rome. They were the government. There was some political unrest that started, and then some civil wars that started to characterize that later Republican period in Rome. We also know that the Romans built these really elaborate, extravagant gymnasiums and something called a palestra, which is where these people would, these again, aristocratic, usually males would go and lounge and relax and have these philosophical discussions. They talked about like, had intellectual education during this time. And they did some sort of physical activity, but they really focused on, like it says at the bottom, that mind-body synergy, which is something that they took from the Greeks from early BC times. Then we see within the Roman Republic, more military training became very superior to intellectual attainment. And so there's a difference between morals, like moral education and intellectual education. Moral education is more about like how to be the best citizen and what we can do for our city state in order to have like the highest military supremacy. And so they had that moral training, like really dedicated to being the best citizen and being the best physically. That goal was to become a citizen soldier for these Romans. They were drafted for war, and they stayed in war in Rome for a very long time. When not training, they did really enjoy being spectators at festivals. And so think of all the ancient Roman festivals. There's a lot of movie depictions of this. They did attend this on a very regular basis when they were not training. The Roman woman had a very high social status compared to the Greek women and compared to the Athenian women, or sorry, the Spartan women, Athenian women, which are both considered Greek women. The Roman women had a very high social status, and they did a lot of the festival attending. They did a lot of spectating at different types of events, and they found that to be kind of what they did for their recreation. All right, Roman Empire. And so if you are not familiar with the Roman Empire, which I'm sure most of you are, there's an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire that spanned several countries and city-states and spanned several time frames. And so kind of first talking about the gladiator time period, games and festivals were held a lot during Rome. They built the Colosseum, and people were spectators at the Colosseum, and there were also people who competed. But the competitors were actually lower class citizens. Sometimes it was prisoners were the ones that were the competitors during the or in these Roman festivals during these gladiator time periods. They were either lower class citizens or prisoners. And so the higher class individuals were actually just the spectators. Um, we did have some professional athletes that would compete in these gladiator competitions when the prisoners and lower class individuals weren't. So there was kind of different ranks of like festivals and these gladiator competitions. During this time, we saw a lot of loss of individual freedoms. We had less emphasis on the actual military. We had a decay of morals. Because a lot of the events that took place at the Colosseum were considered bloodbaths, where they had fights with animals. And this is kind of where the prisoners came in. The lower class citizens would fight animals. They would also have these really rough chariot races that would result in a lot of deaths. They also have just like fight to the death. Again, this is where the professional athletes usually didn't do this. It was more of like the lower class or the prisoners that would do this. There were some professional athlete competitions between that. Again, it would be, fight to the death. And then one time they actually filled up the Colosseum with water and had a like mock sea battle. And so where they filled up the Colosseum and had ships like battling each other, which again, that only happened, I think, once. Again, very fascinating what they did in the Colosseum. Roman Empire, you can see here the eastern and the western side of the Roman Empire, where we had a lot of training of young men who had to train morally to develop their loyalty, discipline, and then also their physical fitness. They did a lot of Greek-like activities. So what was done in Greek, they now did in Rome in order to train. They did start trying to emphasize becoming more peaceful with each other. They were expanding their territory. So they were expanding territories across all of Europe. We look up here and by AD 717 or 117 AD, the empire spanned 3 continents. But the Western Empire falls pretty early in 476 AD, and that Eastern Empire did continue in Europe into the Middle Ages. And so let me go back. What led to the fall of the Roman Empire was they had captured captured too much land, and they had control over too much land and not enough military to control it. There were infestation of barbarians who came and tried to fight and take over the land. There was also diseases that knocked out a lot of Roman soldiers during this time. Another is a clash of governance, like how to rule. So different types of democratic ideals on how to actually rule the continents. And so there was lots of different issues that came about that resulted in the fall of the Western Empire. Then that got into medieval Europe. Medieval Europe is sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. During this time, it was kind of like a physical test just to live. There was no actual physical education. There was no like physical activity for fitness. They basically were just trying to survive. You can see up here, we're kind of in 500 to, what am I trying to say? 1250 AD. So we're kind of moving up into our we're getting closer to like our Renaissance time, like early European history. We see what the peasants did. We see that women also had a lot of roles in maintaining basically their life and just to kind of live. The later years of the Dark Ages or this medieval Europe timeframe there were more frivolous type activities done. They were able to start embracing physical fitness and train physically and do more recreational activities, start working more on like social and like emotional well-being, moral type training in those later years due to, like it says, that economic expansion, trade, commerce started to become more popular. But these castles here, you see a lot of this from medieval Europe timeframe. We see these large walls that surrounded all these castles and these moats. Because during the early medieval time, like I said, it was a lot of, after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was a lot of trying to hold on to your land, hold on to whatever community that you've established, because of all the people that were trying to come in and capture and take over. As the Roman Empire had crumbled and people were trying to kind of establish where they were in history at this time. More about kind of moving into Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Enlightenment. You can see we're kind of getting to 1250, 1700 AD. Now I kind of want you to think of the movie The Knight's Tale, these squires, these knights competing in tournaments. Then we move into like the Renaissance time age where we shift more to like artistic type ideals. And then Age of Enlightenment, we get into some gymnastics programs. And so let's first start in Middle Ages. Knightly training is something y'all are probably familiar with or have seen in lots of different movies. You can kind of see the time frame of young boys at this time, how they become a page, a squire, then they're able to qualify to be a knight. We also have these different tournaments down here at the bottom, which you're probably familiar with, jousting, where we have these knights armed with lancets trying to unset each other off of their horses. There was this tournament called the Melee, and this was a combat between knights, but it actually became so I guess destructive, where we saw a lot of death during these tournaments, that they decided that jousting was probably the better route to go down because there were less deaths with just the jousting tournaments compared to these other melee tournaments. During the Renaissance and Reformation, we saw this appreciation for classical art. So art, different types of music, different types of other artistic ideals. People were able to engage in philosophical type studies, influence towards physical education. Education was valued for boys, but we did not see a lot of education for girls. They did get some sort of training at home, like intellectual, moral type education from their moms at home. This was also a time where health became very important due to the epidemics that had overcome so many different communities in previous centuries, previous decades. We now wanted to stress becoming healthier. And then, like I said about this artistic kind of explosion, they wanted to start depicting the human body as a revelation of beauty. And this is where the Vitruvian Man comes in, which you see up here by Leonardo da Vinci, that displays like the ideal proportions of man, which is something that we still value today. During the Age of Enlightenment, we're still focusing on a sound body and a sound mind, which is very similar to that Greek ideal. A sound body is referring to the man of action, where a sound mind is referring to the man of wisdom. And so that is still emphasized. We're still like taking those Greek philosophies, those Greek ideals, and putting them into practice in the 1700s even. And so John Locke was a philosopher who believed in the best development is through moral and physical discipline. He was very strict with his training when he worked on educating young boys to become physically and educationally sound. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stressed everything according to nature. He developed the principle of naturalism. So basically, he believed in training based on natural processes and also learning through nature. So learning through nature and then training very naturally, and how the human body develops is how we should focus on the different activities that we expose ourselves to. Next, we get into English sports. And so with English sports in the 1800s, they also, these young British men had this ideal of British sportsmanship and said that basically being a sportsman makes the best citizen. They believed that playing lots of different sports for the game's sake, like playing the sport for the game's sake, which means playing the game the way the game's designed, and because like I'm an athlete, like I'm a sportsman. They did lots of different activities, rugby. They had something called association football, which was a spin off of rugby. Cricket, track and field, rowing were very popular sports during this time. They had this idea of this British amateur sports ideal, which, like I said a second ago, is playing the game for the game's sake. It's basically saying that I play this game because I'm an athlete, I'm a sportsman, and I'm actually not playing to improve my physical fitness or get stronger. I'm play the game because like that's what we do is we play the game. And it was mostly done, like it says, by these upperclassmen. They played several different sports, very common at lots of boarding schools that they went to, lots of different sports. And they didn't actually train for skills. They didn't really ever practice. They just played. They just played the game for the game's sake. They thought sports was, like I said, the best way to become the best sportsman. Is they believed it taught socialization, leadership, loyalty, cooperation, discipline, initiative. And that's very true. We still believe that today is why we put children in sports, because it does teach us all of that. And so that's kind of where this all came from, is sports were to create like the best citizen, the best person, the best sportsman. And so that's kind of why we believe that today as well. Another term that these Englishmen used was muscular Christianity. And this was emphasized, this was kind of created through being very masculine. And that masculinity that they achieved was through playing sports. They did, like I said, they didn't do like any, like a lot of weightlifting. They didn't do a lot of actual skill training or other physical activities. They just played lots of different sports. And that is what improved their masculinity. And it developed their character. And so this muscular Christianity is this high character of these young British men, these young British sportsmen, as well as being very like masculine. You can view it as the same way that women viewed feminism in the late 19th century. So if you see over here, we're in the 1800s. 1800s, women were not expected to play a lot of sports or be very physically active. They did engage in, tennis, croquet, badminton. They did start kind of doing golf. And so it was these sports where you were still able to express your femininity, as these young women did not believe, and people did not believe in engaging in very vigorous exercise. So it's the same way we have this muscular Christianity, and the same way women viewed like being very feminine. But yeah, that finishes up the first part of this lecture. And then we'll come back for part 2. Okay, great. Thanks for listening, and we'll get back soon.